He came to talk about his legacy, but when Jimmy crossed the line, Chuck Norris stood up and walked out on live TV. Welcome to Chuck Norris Heroics. Let's uncover what really happened. The familiar theme music of Jimmy Kimmel Live faded and the studio audience's applause settled as Jimmy Kimmel, beaming with his trademark practiced affability, turned to his guest. Across from him, looking every bit the stoic legend he was, sat Chuck Norris. Dressed in a simple, well-cut dark blazer, a crisp light blue shirt, and dark jeans, Norris exuded a quiet confidence that needed no embellishment. He was on the show, ostensibly, to discuss a new edition of his autobiography, which included reflections on his long career and the changing landscape of Hollywood and American culture. The initial banter was light, almost predictably so. Kimmel joked about Norris's iconic status, the seemingly endless stream of Chuck Norris facts, and the actor's surprising longevity in a notoriously fickle industry. Norris, for his part, played along with good humor, his responses concise, occasionally tinged with a dry wit that often caught audiences by surprise. He spoke of his early days, the discipline of martial arts, and the values instilled in him by his mother and his time in the Air Force. There was a warmth to his anecdotes, a genuineness that contrasted sharply with the often cynical veneer of late-night television. "It's amazing, Chuck," Kimmel said, leaning back in his chair, a familiar glint in his eye that often preceded a more pointed line of questioning. "You've managed to stay relevant for decades. Not just relevant, but beloved. What's the secret? Is it the roundhouse kicks, or just good, clean living?" Norris offered a slight smile. "I think it's mostly been about trying to stay true to what I believe in, Jimmy. And maybe a little bit of luck and a lot of hard work. The principles I learned early on about respect, discipline, perseverance, those don't really go out of style." The audience nodded, a murmur of approval rippling through the studio. It was the kind of earnest, straightforward answer they expected from a man like Chuck Norris. But Kimmel's smile tightened, just a fraction. "Respect, discipline, perseverance," he repeated, almost tasting the words. "Those are powerful virtues. But Hollywood's changed a lot since you started, hasn't it? It's a different world now. More aware, perhaps. More focused on social justice, on accountability. How does someone with, let's say, more traditional values navigate that?" The shift in tone was subtle, but palpable. Norris's gaze, which had been relaxed, sharpened slightly. He took a moment before answering, his eyes steady on Kimmel. "I think those values are timeless, Jimmy. Respect for others, taking responsibility for your actions, trying to do good in the world. Those aren't traditional so much as they are fundamental. The landscape might change, the conversations might evolve, but the core of what makes a good person, a good citizen, that stays pretty consistent in my view." Kimmel nodded slowly, as if considering this. "Fair enough. But you've also been associated with certain causes, certain viewpoints over the years that some might see as, well, not entirely aligned with where Hollywood, or much of the country, is today. I'm talking about your faith, your more conservative leanings. Do you ever feel a pressure to, update your software, so to speak?" The question, though couched in Kimmel's usual jocular style, landed with a thud. Norris didn't bristle, but a certain stillness came over him. The easygoing demeanor receded, replaced by a more watchful, considered presence. "My faith is personal, Jimmy. It's a foundation for me, and my political views are my own, developed over a lifetime of experience, just like anyone else's. I don't believe in imposing my views on others, but I also don't believe in apologizing for them. As for updating, I believe in learning and growing, but not in abandoning core principles just because they become unfashionable in certain circles." The studio was quiet. The air, moments before light and jovial, now held a new tension. Kimmel's expression was unreadable, but he pressed on, the initial probe having found, perhaps, the very nerve he intended to strike. He picked up one of his blue cue cards, glancing at it briefly before setting it down with an air of casual deliberation. This was no longer just friendly banter about a book tour. The interview was taking a turn, and Chuck Norris, a man not known for backing down, seemed to sense it acutely. The scent of confrontation, however faint, began to permeate the studio air, unnoticed by many in the audience perhaps. but certainly not by the two men at the center of the stage. Norris adjusted his position in the chair, a minimal movement, yet it conveyed a readiness, a subtle shift from relaxed guest to a man preparing to stand his ground. He had navigated countless interviews over his career, fended off intrusive questions, and maintained his composure under scrutiny. But something in Kimmel's approach, a certain premeditated edge, felt different, more pointed, as if the host was not merely seeking an interview, but an engagement. The polished surface of late-night television was beginning to crack, revealing the more complex and potentially combustible dynamics beneath. Kimmel continued, his tone still light, but the undercurrent more pronounced. That's a very diplomatic answer, Chuck. But let's be honest, some of the things you've supported, some of the groups you've associated with, they've been criticized for being, shall we say, less than inclusive. For example, your vocal support for traditional family values. In today's climate, that's often interpreted as a direct challenge to LGBTQ+ rights. How do you reconcile your faith-based positions with Hollywood's strong push for diversity and inclusion? Norris's eyes, a piercing blue that had unnerved many a screen villain, remained fixed on Kimmel. There was no anger in them, not yet, but a profound seriousness. My support for what I call traditional family values comes from my faith and my upbringing, Jimmy. It's about the importance of a strong family unit, whatever that may look like, in raising children with a moral compass. It's not about excluding anyone or denying anyone's dignity. My faith teaches love and respect for all people, and I believe true inclusion means accepting that people can hold different beliefs without being labeled or condemned. The audience was very still now. The usual coughs and rustles had subsided. They were witnessing not just an interview, but a careful dance on a very fine line. Kimmel, however, seemed determined to push Norris off that line. But Chuck, some would argue that those beliefs, however well-intentioned, do cause harm. That they contribute to a climate where certain groups feel marginalized, even threatened. When you're a public figure of your stature, don't your words carry a certain weight, a responsibility that goes beyond personal conviction? Norris took a slow breath. Every word we speak carries weight, Jimmy. That's why I choose mine carefully. And I believe the greatest responsibility we have is to treat each other with decency, even when we disagree. You speak of a climate. I've seen many climates change over my lifetime. What I haven't seen change is the fundamental need for kindness and understanding. Labeling people, shutting down dialogue because their views don't align with a particular ideology, that's what truly causes harm. That's what creates division. Kimmel leaned forward, a slight smirk playing on his lips. So, you're saying it's the labeling that's the problem, not the underlying beliefs that might be seen as discriminatory? That's a clever way to sidestep the issue, isn't it? Kind of like a verbal Aikido move. The reference to martial arts was not lost on Norris, nor was the condescending tone. A muscle twitched in Norris's jaw, a telltale sign of his restraint being tested. It's not about sidestepping, Jimmy. It's about addressing the root of the problem. The problem isn't that people have different beliefs. The problem is when we stop listening to each other, when we assume the worst intentions, when we try to silence voices rather than engage with them respectfully. I've spent a lifetime in martial arts, and the first principle is respect. Respect for your opponent, respect for your teacher, respect for yourself. That seems to be a principle that's sorely lacking in much of public discourse today. The conviction in Norris's voice was undeniable. He wasn't just reciting talking points. He was speaking from a place of deeply held belief. Kimmel, however, appeared unfazed, almost as if he had anticipated this line of defense and was ready with a counter. He shuffled his blue cards again, a deliberate, almost theatrical gesture. Respect is a two-way street, though, Chuck. And some would say that certain traditional views, particularly when they're amplified by a celebrity, don't show much respect for people who live differently or believe differently. It's easy to talk about respect in the abstract, but what about the real-world impact of those views on, say, a young person struggling with their identity who hears someone they admire espousing values that seem to invalidate their very existence? The camera zoomed in slightly on Norris's face. The lines, etched by time and experience, seemed more prominent under the harsh studio lights. He was no longer just a guest promoting a book. He was a man being publicly cross-examined about the core of his being. The audience could feel the temperature in the studio dropping, the convivial atmosphere replaced by a palpable tension. Norris's response, when it came, was measured, but the quiet intensity was unmistakable. He was choosing his words with the precision of a martial artist selecting his next move, knowing that each one had to be perfectly placed, perfectly timed. The game Kimmel had initiated was becoming more serious with every exchange, and the stakes were rising. Norris looked directly at Kimmel, his gaze unwavering. "Jimmy, if a young person is struggling, the last thing they need is more division and judgment from any side. They need support. They need love. They need to know they're valued. My faith, at its core, is about love. Love for God and love for your neighbor. It's not about condemnation. And I would never want any word or action of mine to make any young person feel invalidated. That's a gross mischaracterization of what I stand for. And frankly, it feels like you're deliberately trying to twist my words and my intentions." The accusation hung in the air. Chuck Norris, a man known for his stoicism, was openly calling out the host for misrepresentation. Kimmel's smile faltered for a split second, then returned, a little too wide, a little too forced. "Twisting your words, Chuck? I'm just asking questions that a lot of people are asking. We're in a different era. The things that might have been acceptable to say or imply 10, 20 years ago, they don't fly anymore. There's a new standard of accountability, especially for public figures. You can't just say my faith teaches love and then support policies or associate with groups that actively harm or exclude people and expect not to be challenged on it. Who said I support policies that harm people?" Norris countered, his voice rising slightly, a hint of steel now evident. "You're making assumptions, Jimmy. You're painting with a very broad brush, and you're attributing views to me that I haven't expressed. I believe in free speech, and that includes the freedom to believe differently. Accountability is important, but so is fairness. And what you're doing right now doesn't feel fair. It feels like an interrogation designed to paint me into a corner you've already constructed." Several audience members exchanged uneasy glances. The playful atmosphere of a late-night talk show had completely evaporated, replaced by the stark tension of a courtroom drama. Kimmel pressed on, relentless. "Okay, let's talk specifics then. You've been a vocal supporter of the Second Amendment. In a country plagued by gun violence, with school shootings becoming terrifyingly common, how do you reconcile that support with the safety of children, with the pleas of parents who've lost their loved ones? Isn't there a point where tradition or rights have to be weighed against the overwhelming evidence of harm?" Norris's face was grim. "That's a profound and tragic issue, Jimmy, and it deserves a serious, nuanced discussion, not a soundbite in a late-night interview where you're clearly trying to score points. My support for the Second Amendment is about the right of law-abiding citizens to protect themselves and their families. It's not about endorsing violence. And like most Americans, I'm horrified by the violence we see. But the causes are complex, and the solutions aren't as simple as some would like to believe. Demonizing millions of responsible gun owners isn't the answer. But isn't that a deflection, Chuck?" Kimmel interjected, his voice sharp. "Isn't that the standard NRA talking point? When does the right to bear arms supersede the right to live without fear of being gunned down in a classroom or a grocery store? At what point do complex causes become an excuse for inaction?" The silence in the studio was heavy. Chuck Norris, a man who had built a career on playing heroes who took decisive action, was being accused of offering excuses for inaction on one of America's most painful issues. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on his knees, his expression one of deep frustration. "Jimmy, I'm not here to debate gun control policy with you. I can talk about my book. But since you brought it up, let me be clear. I believe in responsible gun ownership. I believe in common sense measures that keep guns out of the hands of criminals and those who are mentally unstable. But I also believe that focusing solely on the tool, rather than the multitude of societal issues that contribute to violence, like mental health, broken families, a culture that sometimes glorifies violence, is a mistake. And to imply that anyone who supports the Second Amendment is somehow indifferent to the suffering caused by gun violence is deeply offensive and wrong. His voice, though controlled, carried a weight of conviction that resonated through the studio. The audience, regardless of their personal views on the issue, could not mistake the sincerity and the pain in his words. Kimmel, however, seemed to see an opening, a chance to further corner his guest. He was relentless, pushing the boundaries of journalistic inquiry far into the realm of personal attack, and the tension was becoming almost unbearable for those watching. Kimmel's eyes narrowed, his demeanor shifting from interrogator to prosecutor. Offensive, Chuck? What's truly offensive is the endless cycle of thoughts and prayers while children are dying. What's offensive is the refusal of so-called responsible gun owners to support meaningful reforms that could actually save lives. You talk about common sense measures, but many of the organizations you've supported have fought tooth and nail against even the most basic background checks or restrictions on assault weapons. How is that not being indifferent to suffering? The accusation was direct, brutal. Chuck Norris's legendary composure seemed to fray at the edges. A flicker of raw emotion, something akin to anger, crossed his face before he visibly reined it in. Jimmy, you are now deliberately misrepresenting my positions and affiliations. I have never supported organizations that oppose keeping guns out of the wrong hands. I have, however, supported organizations that defend the constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens. There's a difference. And to equate that with indifference to the loss of innocent lives is a slanderous and, frankly, a disgusting tactic. The word disgusting hung in the air, a stark departure from Norris's usual measured tone. The audience gasped. This was no longer an interview. It was a battle of wills, a clash of worldviews, broadcast live to millions. Kimmel, far from backing down, seemed to relish the confrontation. Slanderous? Disgusting? Strong words, Chuck. But are they stronger than the images of grieving parents? Are they stronger than the fear that students feel every day going to school? It seems to me that when your principles lead to inaction in the face of such tragedy, those principles need to be re-examined. Or perhaps they're not principles at all, but just excuses for clinging to an outdated and dangerous ideology. Chuck Norris stood up. The movement was sudden, decisive, and it sent a ripple of shock through the studio. He was a tall man, and his presence, now fully charged with righteous indignation, seemed to fill the stage. Kimmel, for the first time, looked genuinely startled, perhaps even a little intimidated. "I will not sit here, Jimmy," Norris began, his voice low but carrying an undeniable authority, "and allow you to use the very real pain of victims of violence to score cheap political points and attack my character. What you're doing is not journalism. It is not even entertainment. It is a shameful exploitation of tragedy for the sake of creating a viral moment." Kimmel, regaining some of his composure, tried to interject. "Now, Chuck, I think you're being overly sensitive." "Overly sensitive?" Norris cut him off, his voice like a whip crack. "You think discussing the slaughter of children and then twisting my words to imply I'm complicit is something one should not be sensitive about? You're sitting there in your comfortable chair, in your safe studio, pontificating about issues you clearly understand only on a superficial, partisan level, and you have the audacity to tell me I'm being overly sensitive." The producers in the control room were in a state of panic. This had gone far beyond anything they had anticipated. Calls were likely being made, emergency protocols discussed, but on stage, the confrontation continued, raw and unfiltered. Norris took a step towards Kimmel's desk, not menacingly, but with the focused intensity of a man who had reached his breaking point. "You invited me on this show, presumably to have a conversation. Instead, you've launched a premeditated attack, armed with distortions and accusations. You haven't sought understanding. You've sought conflict. You haven't aimed for dialogue. You've aimed for demolition." The alliteration was powerful, the indictment clear. Kimmel, though visibly shaken, attempted to defend himself. I'm just asking the tough questions, Chuck. The questions everyone is afraid to ask you. You're a public icon. You're not immune to scrutiny. The atmosphere was electric, the silence only broken by Norris's measured, yet forceful, reply. This was a masterclass in controlled anger, a performance of a lifetime, not on a movie set, but in the glaring reality of a late-night show gone terribly wrong. Scrutiny, Jimmy, is one thing, Norris stated, his voice resonating with a cold, hard clarity. What you're engaging in is a character assassination attempt, wrapped in the guise of social commentary. You talk about tough questions, but these aren't questions designed to elicit thoughtful answers. These are accusations. You've already tried and convicted me in your own mind, and now you're just looking for me to confirm your predetermined narrative. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the stunned audience, then back to Kimmel, who now looked genuinely uneasy, his usual smirk replaced by a look of dawning realization that he had profoundly miscalculated. For decades, I've tried to live my life, both publicly and privately, according to a certain set of principles. Integrity, honor, respect, treating others as I'd like to be treated. These aren't just words to me, Jimmy. They're the bedrock of who I am. And you, in the span of a few minutes, have attempted to dismantle that, to paint me as something I am not for what? A few extra clicks? A controversial segment that will get people talking. Kimmel opened his mouth, then closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. The tables had turned dramatically. The hunter had become the hunted, and the usually glib host found himself speechless before the quiet, steely indignation of his guest. I've faced tougher opponents than you, Jimmy, Norris continued, his voice still low but carrying immense weight. In dojos, in filming action sequences, even in life. But they, at least, often fought with a sense of honor. What you're doing here lacks even that. It's a cowardly ambush, plain and simple. The word cowardly struck Kimmel like a physical blow. His face flushed, and he finally found his voice, albeit a strained and defensive one. Cowardly? I'm giving you a platform to respond, to clarify your positions. If you can't defend them, maybe that's not my fault. Maybe that says more about your views than my questions. Norris shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. This isn't a platform for clarification, Jimmy. This is a stage for your pre-scripted drama. You're not interested in my answers unless they fit the villainous caricature you're trying to create. You're not interested in truth. You're interested in television. And that's the tragedy here. You have an opportunity to elevate discourse, to bring people together, to explore complex issues with nuance and respect. Instead, you choose this. You choose division. You choose attack. He took another step back from the desk, a gesture of disengagement. I came here in good faith. I came here to talk about things I care about, to share some reflections from my life. But it's clear you have no interest in that. Your agenda was set before I even walked on this stage. The finality in his tone was chilling. The audience remained silent, transfixed. They were witnessing the complete implosion of a late-night interview, a public figure known for his toughness revealing a different kind of strength, the strength to walk away from a toxic engagement, to refuse to participate in his own denigration. The control room was likely a scene of utter chaos, producers and network executives scrambling, but on stage, there was a strange, terrible clarity. Chuck Norris was drawing a line, not just for himself, but for the very nature of public discourse. He was making a stand against a brand of media engagement that he clearly found reprehensible, and he was doing it on one of its most prominent stages. The implications were vast, and the silence in the studio was a testament to the gravity of the moment. Kimmel, now visibly flustered and defensive, stammered. That's not fair, Chuck. I'm a comedian. This is a comedy show. We make jokes. We push boundaries. If you can't handle a little heat, then maybe you shouldn't be in the public eye. It was a weak defense, and it only seemed to solidify Norris's resolve. Heat, Jimmy? Is that what you call it? Deliberately distorting a person's beliefs, attacking their character, and using their family's tragedies for a punchline? That's not heat. That's a lack of basic human decency. And as for comedy, I've been around comedians my whole life. Real comedians, Jimmy. They punch up. They challenge the powerful. They make people think while they laugh. What you're doing is punching down, and there's nothing funny about it. There's nothing brave about it. Norris began to unclip his microphone. The small, deliberate movements were amplified by the silence, each click and rustle sounding like a judgment. The audience watched, mesmerized. This was no longer about gun control or family values. It was about respect, professionalism, and the abuse of a powerful media platform. "You know," Norris said, his voice now quieter, almost weary, but still firm, "I've always believed that the true measure of a man is not how he acts when things are easy, but how he conducts himself when faced with adversity, with challenge, with disrespect. I've tried to uphold that in my own life. I try to teach it to my children, to my students." He placed a microphone carefully on the edge of Kimmel's desk. The gesture was polite, yet it felt like a final, definitive act of severance. "I think our conversation here is over, Jimmy. I have nothing more to say to you, or to an audience that you seem to believe enjoys this kind of spectacle." Kimmel's face was a mask of shock and dawning panic. "Chuck, wait. You can't just walk out. We have a commercial break coming up. We can talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," Norris stated flatly. He turned to the audience, his expression softening slightly. "To all of you here tonight, and to everyone watching at home, I apologize that you had to witness this. I came here with the intention of having a respectful discussion. That has clearly not been possible." He then looked directly into the main camera, his gaze piercing. "Perhaps this will serve as a reminder that integrity and decency should still mean something, even in Hollywood, even on late-night television." With that, Chuck Norris turned and began to walk off the stage. The silence in the studio was absolute for a heartbeat. Then it was shattered, not by Kimmel, but by a smattering of applause from the audience. It started small, hesitant, then grew, swelling into a wave of support. People were standing, clapping, some even cheering. They were applauding not just a celebrity, but a man who had refused to be bullied, who had stood his ground with dignity. Kimmel sat stunned, his face pale, watching the iconic figure walk away. The applause was not for him. The cheers were not for his show. In that moment, Jimmy Kimmel, the master of snark, the king of the late-night roast, was utterly and completely alone, his carefully constructed persona in ruins. The red applause sign flickered weakly, then went dark, as if even the machinery of the show understood that something irreparable had just occurred. The legendary martial artist, actor, and cultural icon had delivered his final, most powerful move, not with a kick or a punch, but with the quiet, unshakable force of his character. The fallout would be immense, but in that moment, all that mattered was the sight of Chuck Norris walking away, his integrity intact, leaving a stunned silence and a blaze of unexpected applause in his wake. The walk-off was swift and decisive. Chuck Norris didn't look back. As he disappeared behind the curtain, the studio audience's applause intensified, a spontaneous and heartfelt reaction that clearly wasn't for the host. Jimmy Kimmel remained frozen at his desk, his face a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. The carefully orchestrated rhythm of his show had been shattered, and he was left to pick up the pieces in front of a live audience and millions watching at home. The stage manager, headset askew, rushed onto the set during the applause, gesturing frantically, presumably trying to signal an emergency commercial break. Kimmel, however, seemed incapable of reacting. He just stared at the empty guest chair, then out at the audience, whose applause was now morphing into a confused, excited buzz. When the show finally did cut to an unscheduled commercial, the control room was reportedly in chaos. Network executives were on the line, demanding explanations. Kimmel's writers and producers were scrambling, trying to figure out how to salvage the rest of the broadcast, if it was even salvageable. Backstage, Norris was met by his own small team. There were no triumphant declarations, no angry outbursts. He simply retrieved his jacket, nodded to his publicist, and prepared to leave. When asked by a stunned production assistant if he was okay, Norris reportedly replied with a calm, "I'm fine, but I think the show has a problem." The problem was already exploding online. Snippets of the confrontation, likely filmed by audience members on their phones despite studio prohibitions, were beginning to surface on social media. The hashtags #KimmelNorris, #ChuckWalks, and #RespectChuckNorris were starting to trend even before the West Coast broadcast had concluded. Viewers who had seen the East Coast feed were already dissecting every moment, every word. The initial reaction was overwhelmingly in Norris's favor. People lauded his composure, his articulate defense of his principles, and his courage in confronting Kimmel directly. Kimmel, on the other hand, was being widely condemned for his aggressive, disrespectful, and seemingly premeditated line of questioning. Terms like ambush, bully, and unprofessional were frequently attached to his name. By the next morning, the incident was the lead story on entertainment news outlets worldwide. Major newspapers and commentators weighed in. Some defended Kimmel's right to ask tough questions, but the vast majority criticized his methods and tone, particularly the personal nature of his attacks and his apparent glee in trying to corner Norris. Chuck Norris himself remained silent, issuing no further statement. His actions on the show had spoken for themselves. His team simply confirmed that he had left the studio and would be making no further comment on the matter. This dignified silence only amplified the public's respect for him, contrasting sharply with the frantic damage control efforts reportedly underway at Kimmel's show and the network. Advertisers were said to be concerned. Social media was a firestorm. Fellow celebrities began to weigh in, with many expressing support for Norris and criticizing the increasingly combative nature of some late-night interviews. Some pointed out a perceived double standard, arguing that Kimmel would not have dared to treat a guest with different political leanings, or perhaps a female guest, with such overt hostility on such personal matters. The debate raged. Was Kimmel a hard-hitting journalist holding power to account, or an out-of-touch entertainer who had mistaken bullying for bravery? The consensus, particularly among viewers, seemed to lean heavily towards the latter. The fallout for Jimmy Kimmel Live was immediate. Ratings for the subsequent nights reportedly dipped. Petitions circulated online calling for Kimmel to apologize, and some even for his dismissal. The show's carefully cultivated image as a hip, edgy, but ultimately good-natured platform for celebrity chat had been severely tarnished. In the days that followed, the narrative became less about the specific issues Kimmel raised and more about the manner in which he raised them. It became a case study in how not to conduct an interview, a lesson in the difference between provocative questioning and outright disrespect. Chuck Norris, by refusing to engage on Kimmel's terms and ultimately walking away, had, in a strange way, won the encounter far more decisively than if he had stayed and traded barbs. He had maintained his dignity, stood by his principles, and exposed a rawness in the media landscape that many found deeply unsettling. The image of him walking off stage, not in anger but in a profound assertion of self-respect, became an iconic television moment. The network, facing mounting pressure, eventually issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging that the interview did not meet the show's usual standards of respectful discourse. It was a non-apology that satisfied few. Jimmy Kimmel himself remained off-air for a couple of pre-scheduled vacation days immediately following the incident, a timing that many observers found conveniently suspicious. When he returned, his opening monologue was uncharacteristically subdued. He didn't address the Norris interview directly, but spoke vaguely about passionate conversations and the complexities of live television. Critics panned it as a weak attempt to sidestep responsibility. Chuck Norris's book, ironically, saw a surge in sales. People were curious about the man who had so calmly and powerfully stood up to a media giant. His traditional values, which Kimmel had tried to frame as outdated, were suddenly being discussed with a new level of respect, or at least curiosity, by a public weary of what they perceived as media, bullying, and ideological grandstanding. The incident also sparked a broader conversation within the entertainment industry about the nature of celebrity interviews and the responsibility of hosts. Were they journalists? Entertainers? Provocateurs? And where was the line between holding public figures accountable and simply creating conflict for ratings? Many argued that Kimmel had crossed that line irrevocably. For Chuck Norris, the episode seemed to be just another chapter in a long and storied life, a moment where his real-world principles were tested on a very public stage, and he had not been found wanting. He continued with his commitments, his charity work, and his quiet life, seemingly unfazed by the media storm he had weathered. His legacy, already secure, was perhaps even burnished by the encounter, recasting him in the public eye not just as an action hero, but as a man of unshakable integrity. The long-term impact on Jimmy Kimmel's career remained to be seen. Some predicted he would recover, that the short attention span of the public and the forgiving nature of the news cycle would allow him to eventually move past the incident. Others, however, believed that a fundamental trust had been broken with his audience, that the mask had slipped, revealing something less palatable underneath his comedic persona. The image of him, stunned and speechless as Chuck Norris walked away, became a symbol of a particular kind of media arrogance, meeting an immovable object of personal conviction. It was a reminder that true strength isn't always about the loudest voice or the sharpest insult, but sometimes it's about the quiet dignity of knowing when to speak your truth and when to simply walk away. The studio where the confrontation occurred became, for a time, a focal point for media analysis, a sort of ground zero for discussions about the state of public discourse. The empty guest chair, in retrospect, seemed to hold more power than Kimmel's monologue podium. In the end, the fiery altercation on Jimmy Kimmel Live served as more than just a viral television moment. It became a cultural touchstone, a stark illustration of the clash between deeply held personal values and the often superficial, conflict-driven demands of modern media. Chuck Norris, in his unexpected and dramatic exit, had not just walked off a television set. He had, for many, walked onto a higher ground, demonstrating that some principles are not for sale, not even for the bright lights of Hollywood. The silence he left behind was, in many ways, louder and more profound than any of the angry words that had preceded it. It was the silence of a point made, a line drawn, and a lesson delivered, not with a roundhouse kick, but with the unwavering strength of character. The dust from the on-air explosion took weeks, even months, to truly settle. In the immediate aftermath, Jimmy Kimmel Live saw a noticeable dip in its viewership numbers, and the show's comment sections online were flooded with criticism. Advertisers, ever wary of controversy, reportedly re-evaluated their commitments. While Kimmel did not lose his job, the incident undeniably altered his public perception. His attempts to return to his usual comedic style often felt strained, the ghost of the Norris confrontation looming over the studio. He became more cautious, his interviews less overtly aggressive, but for many, the damage to his credibility as an impartial or even good-natured host was lasting. He had been exposed, not just as a comedian who could occasionally push boundaries, but as someone capable of what many saw as a calculated and cruel ambush. This perception, once solidified, proved difficult to shake. For Chuck Norris, the incident had an almost opposite effect. He hadn't sought the confrontation, but his handling of it resonated deeply with a public that often felt overwhelmed by media figures who seemed to prioritize conflict over substance. His quiet dignity, his refusal to be goaded beyond a certain point, and his ultimate decision to remove himself from a disrespectful situation were seen as acts of strength, not weakness. His book sales continued to climb, and invitations for speaking engagements, particularly on topics of character, integrity, and navigating a changing cultural landscape, increased. He largely declined these, preferring to let his actions on Kimmel's show and his lifetime of work speak for themselves. The incident became a recurring reference point in discussions about media ethics and the responsibilities of those with large public platforms. Journalism schools and media studies programs reportedly use clips of the interview as case studies, analyzing the power dynamics, the ethical breaches, and the audience's reaction. It highlighted a growing weariness among many viewers with what they perceived as partisan gotcha journalism disguised as entertainment. They craved authenticity, and in that moment, Chuck Norris had seemed far more authentic than the host whose job it was to facilitate genuine conversation. Other talk show hosts, perhaps learning from Kimmel's misstep, seemed to subtly adjust their own approaches, particularly when interviewing guests with whom they might have strong ideological disagreements. There was a palpable, if unstated, recognition that audiences had a limit, that there was a line between engaging debate and outright disrespect, and that crossing that line could have severe repercussions. The Chuck Norris moment, as some began to call it, became a shorthand for a public figure successfully turning the tables on an aggressive interviewer by refusing to play their game and instead highlighting the interviewer's own unprofessionalism. It underscored a truth that often gets lost in the clamor of modern media. True power doesn't always lie in controlling the narrative or winning the argument, but in maintaining one's integrity, even if it means walking away from the spotlight. In the longer term, the confrontation may have contributed to a subtle shift in what audiences expect from their late-night entertainment. While comedy and satire remain staples, there was a growing appetite for conversations that, even when challenging, were rooted in mutual respect. The Kimmel-Norris exchange had inadvertently held up a mirror to the less savory aspects of media culture, and many viewers did not like the reflection. Chuck Norris never publicly gloated over Kimmel's predicament. He never issued a told-you-so statement. His silence on the matter, post-incident, was as powerful as his words had been during it. It communicated a sense of having made his point and moved on, leaving Kimmel to grapple with the consequences of his own actions. For Jimmy Kimmel, the path to rehabilitating his image would be long and arduous. It would require more than just a return to jokes and celebrity banter. It would require a demonstration of genuine reflection and a commitment to a more respectful form of engagement. Whether he was capable of or interested in such a transformation remained an open question for his audience and his critics. The empty chair Norris left behind that night became a potent symbol, a silent testament to the fact that even in the high-stakes, often cynical world of entertainment, there are still lines that cannot be crossed without consequence, and that dignity, once lost, is a very hard thing to reclaim. The narrative of the Kimmel-Norris showdown evolved beyond a mere celebrity spat. It tapped into a deeper societal frustration with perceived media bias and the increasingly polarized nature of public discourse. Chuck Norris, an icon from a different era of Hollywood, inadvertently became a symbol for those who felt that values like respect, civility, and genuine dialogue were being eroded by a media landscape obsessed with conflict, clicks, and ideological grandstanding. His stoic defense and ultimate withdrawal were interpreted by many not as an inability to handle tough questions, but as a principled refusal to participate in a demeaning spectacle. This resonated particularly strongly with audiences who felt that public figures they admired were often unfairly targeted or misrepresented by media outlets with clear agendas. The incident also forced a certain amount of introspection within the late-night television genre itself. While no host wants a boring, anodyne show, the Kimmel-Norris confrontation served as a stark reminder of the potential pitfalls of overly aggressive or partisan interview tactics. The line between incisive questioning and disrespectful badgering, between humorous ribbing and personal insult, became a topic of much internal discussion among producers and writers across the industry. There was a recognition that the viral moment at any cost could indeed come at too high a cost, potentially alienating viewers and damaging a show's long-term credibility. For Jimmy Kimmel, the journey forward was fraught. Each monologue, each interview, was scrutinized through the lens of the Norris incident. Was he being fair? Was he being respectful? Or was he reverting to the tactics that had led to such a public and humiliating rebuke? The pressure was immense, and it showed. There were moments when his old spark seemed to return, but often it was tempered by a newfound caution, a reluctance to push too hard, which paradoxically sometimes made his show feel less incisive and more generic. He was caught in a difficult bind, trying to retain his edgy appeal while simultaneously reassuring audiences and potential guests that he was not the bully he had appeared to be that fateful night. Chuck Norris, meanwhile, continued to embody the principles he had articulated. He focused on his philanthropic endeavors, his martial arts schools which emphasized discipline and character, and his family. He didn't leverage the incident for further fame or to launch a crusade against Kimmel or the media. His quiet, dignified retreat from the battlefield, having made a stand, was in itself a powerful statement. It suggested that some victories are won not by prolonging the fight, but by knowing when it's over and when your actions have spoken louder than any further words could. The book he had been promoting at the time of the interview, Reflections on a Life of Action and Principle, continued to sell well, its themes now imbued with a fresh, real-world example of its author living out those very principles under intense public pressure. It became more than just a memoir. It became a testament to the enduring power of character in an often character-deficient world. The legacy of that night was complex. It certainly wasn't a win for late-night television in the traditional sense, but it may have been a win for a more nuanced understanding of public discourse. It demonstrated that audiences, while enjoying entertainment and even a bit of irreverence, also value fairness and respect. It showed that a public figure, even one as seemingly old school as Chuck Norris, could tap into a deep well of public sentiment by simply refusing to be disrespected, by calmly and articulately defending his integrity, and by having the courage to walk away when a line was crossed. The silence that Chuck Norris left in his wake was indeed filled with the loud and clear message that some things are more important than ratings, and some principles are simply not up for negotiation.